and I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Michael Raska, who is well into completing his dissertation at the New School of Public Policy next door. And he's working on a subject of considerable interest to those of us in MEI, which has to do, as you can see, with Israel's security doctrines and practices. Michael came over to visit us a few weeks ago, and we were really quite intrigued as we heard about the interesting work that he has been doing, and I think you are going to hear about that in just a moment. Michael Raska is completing this dissertation. It's called The Revolution in Military Affairs and Its Impact on Military Modernization Trajectories of Israel and South Korea. I don't know how much of the South Korean part we're going to hear. Maybe we will hear some of it. But it's an interesting pair of cases, I think, to compare. He has written on various aspects of international security, including strategic developments on the Korean Peninsula, Israel's defense strategies, U.S. defense transformation, and WMD proliferation. He worked, before he came to the PhD program here, he worked at the Center for Global Cooperation, the Samsung Economic Research Institute. And he's been a research fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, at the Rothberg International School, Pacific Forum CSIS, and the delegation of the European Commission to the Republic of Korea. Michael's got an MA in International Studies from the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. His BA is in International Communications and International Studies summa cum laude from Missouri Southern State University. We will follow our usual procedures. Michael is going to speak for an hour or so. And then we will open it up, as we always do, to your comments and questions. And I will pass off the microphone in the Q&A session, at least after a while, to our new colleague who has just joined us, James Dorsey, renowned foreign correspondent with a strong background in the Middle East. So he will preside at the end if I have to depart. So, it's all yours.
I don't know if I should use a microphone or if I can just speak without a microphone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Or would you guys prefer me to speak with a microphone? Microphone is better. Yeah? All right, I'll try. Thank you very much, Dr. Hudson, for the kind invitation. I really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very happy to be here today and seeing a lot of audience here. And thank you very much for coming and taking time for your busy schedules. I saw the guest list, and most of you are very, practitioners, and some of you may be in places where it is high above my pay grade, because I'm still academic. But nevertheless, I really appreciate it that you guys are here. Now, I would like to begin my talk with usually every good talk starts with a story and a caveat. Okay, so Dr. Hudson mentioned Korea, and you see, I have many different stories from different parts of the world, but my story about Israel starts actually in Korea, where I met this wonderful, most beautiful Israeli girl, and I fell in love with her. And basically, my interest in Israel, basically went through her. And of course, I was captivated by the fact that all Israeli girls, she served in the military, right? Israeli girls go for 2 years in the army. And so she shared with me her army experience, but there's one thing she never told me, and that's her military unit. So I was always wondering, which military unit she served. And of course, being Israeli as she is, she would never tell me. And to this day, we have a tradition that, as much as I go deeper into this subject, I will, every year I will find out different military units in the IDF. And I call her up and say, is this one? And of course, she would say yes, and she would say no. But in any case, this is how my passion for the subject started and continues. Now, caveat, I'm not Israeli, so that means my Hebrew is very elementary. If you meet any Israeli, in the first place, they ask you, do you speak Hebrew? And I say, well, a little bit, it's up.
אני מדבר עברית קצת, זה לא טוב, אבל זה בסדר. You know, I went to Upan and I learned Hebrew a little bit, but the fact is that if I knew Hebrew, I think I would go much deeper into my research, and I realized that during my limitations for my PhD dissertation. That said, you know, I have used all my sources from all Israelis. So, in fact, 2 days ago, I got a call from a friend at Haifa University, and he looked at my paper and he says, "Oh, you have all your sources are Israelis. You have none Israeli there." And I said, "Yeah," and you know, and he said, "Maybe you should use some non-Israelis." So that's a caveat, and you know, a third caveat is, you know, I'm academic. Again, as I said at the beginning, so whatever mistakes I do is purely the responsibility is purely mine. You know, I have never worked for any government. I have never been in the military. I have been basically a student of history, student of strategic studies, and student of political science. Not in that order, exactly. So having said that, you know, let me jump into that topic. And why is it important? So basically, you know, I want to talk about 3 things today. Basically, I will start with what my research area is, what are my research aims, what is my question, what is the puzzle, why am I interested in there. Then I will basically introduce to you the basic Israeli security concept that has been, in essence, since its inception in 1948, to basically guided the Israeli national defense strategy and operational concept for the first 30 years. And then I will basically try to explain or try to describe the challenges of redefining that concept that Israel faced from mid-90s even up to today. So the best way to think about is, you know, think about paradigm shifts. Every country has a paradigm shift. So basically I will talk about 3 paradigms. The basic traditional security concept as the first paradigm. The second period from about 1990s, mid-1980s toward 2010, and I will conclude my presentation where we stand now, precisely, you know, with all the Arab revolutions going on and what are the implications for Israel. This is basically the roadmap and the question for my project. My question is, how have Israel's security concepts, strategic and operational, evolved with the progressive complexity of security challenges? Now, here's the question: why am I interested in Israel? Israel is a unique country, and which has a lot of, you know, put it this way, rough experience in terms of its national security. Since its inception, security conditions of Israel have been in natural conditions. The country has been preparing for or fighting wars, you know, since its inception. So why do we study Israel? One thing, it's not only because you know, it's a hotspot in the world, but I believe that we can learn a lot from Israel. And I think Israeli experience has a lot of lessons for other countries, precisely, you know, even for Singapore. And I think a lot of you are from Singapore, so I think that's why, you know, it's important to study, you know, Israel. And if you look at the threat map, you know, starting from the Cold War, and you know, this threat map can be applied also to the U.S. or to any other country, because security as we know it has changed, has evolved over time. You know, we are no longer in the traditional Cold War setting where you had 2 countries fighting each other, ideologically. We are in a different world today where the different types of threats, and you see a convergence of threats, and the convergence of threats that Israel is facing as well, you know, can be applied to other regional settings. So basically, the whole point is here that we can learn from Israel. Now, what do I mean by security conceptions? What is it? What is security conception? How does it differ from defense strategy and from a military doctrine? And here I will be a little bit more academic. Now, security conception, you have to broadly imagine something is a sum of external reality and internal resources. And it's very semi-informal. It's not written. In fact, Israel has never really written an official formal document that would have
all the elements of national security. You know, for example, Israel doesn't have any white papers on defense. There have never been one formally. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, you know, but officially, Israel has never conceptualized formally its defense strategy or security or military doctrine, you know, formally. What they have, they started with the security conceptions. So they see it as a, you know, generally shared organizing cloud of ideas concerning national security problems reflected in the thinking of the country's political and military elite. You know, so it's a little bit broader. That's how you imagine the security conceptions. Now, you can also understand it that through the difference between defense strategy and military doctrine. Defense strategy and military doctrine can change over time. Security conceptions are much more stable, or basically much more. It's a paradigm of how a country sees itself. So I'll be basically talking about strategic and operational and military levels of this. So if you have any, it's very academic, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. So I'm asking, you know, how the security conceptions, defense strategy, and military doctrine evolve over time with the changing complexity of Israel's security challenges. So here's my, you know, again, my academic framework. Strategies and concepts, security conceptions are important because they shape defense management processes. The way country conceptualizes its security shapes certain processes, and processes then lead to, you know, certain actions or capabilities. So my level of analysis is the first one, the strategies and concepts. I'm looking at basically, as I said, the national security conceptions, defense strategies, and military doctrine. Now, in my dissertation, I originally was planning to write about the processes and capabilities as well, but this is a subject for another dissertation. So this is just the academic framework for those who might be interested. Analysis and evidence. So how did I come up with my research data, or, you know, what is my sources? Basically, as I mentioned at the beginning, Israel has never really published a formal, comprehensive version of its national security doctrine or military strategy. And there are 4 reasons why. Basically, one is there's a need to maintain operational adaptability and decision-making flexibility in an unpredictable security environment. That means you write a plan or you write a defense strategy, and tomorrow security conditions change, and your plan or your defense strategy is useless. Right? So, you know, if you were to think about writing a defense strategy in a very unpredictable security environment, is difficult. The second reason, you have the traditional nature of extensive secrecy or security in matters of Israel. And this is probably more relevant for non-Israelis. I think if you go in Israel, there's a strong debate, a lot of information out there that shows, that gives you information on the topic. But as a non-Israeli, it is very difficult to find information. So you have a traditional nature of secrecy. The third one, I think the most important one, is the persisting internal political consideration and security debates. I think one of the key reasons why Israelis never really wrote a formal document is because they couldn't agree with each other on how they define their security. You know, so, you know, when a lot of people think about Israel as one unitary actor, when you actually go in Israel, it's like a pizza pie. It's like a big pizza. You have on the left side, it's so divided. You have political axis between left and right. Then you have religious, non-religious, and then you can divide them in different spectrum. But probably one of the, I think this is the key reason why they never really wrote it, is just because they couldn't agree with each other. And so that doesn't mean, though, that there haven't been attempts to write a national security doctrine. In fact, there are some internal versions, but the key point is they have never been really published. And of course, the last reason is they have to focus on daily operational needs and issues and problems that preclude any theoretical or conceptual advancement. So in fact, you know, they are basically busy with their daily problems rather than sitting, you know, and thinking about their strategies. So those are basically 4 reasons why.
Now, I have traveled to Israel many times, and then last time I was there in 2009, I had a chance to interview about over 20 interviews with senior IDF officers, active and retired politicians, a lot of interesting people that were willing to share their views on how the concepts have evolved, and at least give you an idea. So my sources are basically from there, and I was very happy to read that. I remember my story that trying to find my girlfriend's intelligence unit, so that landed me in the Israeli National Security Council, right? But I haven't asked that question yet to the head of it. So anyway. So let me explain to you what is the traditional security concept. If you go to Israel tomorrow and somebody says, what is it that you're talking about? First of all, every Israeli thinking on security, traditional-wise, starts with the conception that Israel is in a struggle for its very own survival. Okay? So you had, from 1948, you have founding father of Israel, you have Ben-Gurion, and a couple of IDF generals who basically came up with baseline assumptions that come to the very idea that Israel is in the struggle for its very own survival. And there are basically 4 or 5 tenets of that, right? One, Israel is in a perpetual state of dormant war, even when no active hostilities exist. So there's no really peace in there. Even you may think there is a peace, there is not. So most importantly, given its geostrategic conditions, Israel is placed in a position of geostrategic inferiority. And I will explain what that means. Now, based on that, there are different elements of the geostrategic inferiority. Israel cannot impose unilaterally peace on its enemies. Okay? Israel cannot say we'll make peace because of where it stands. At the same time, it cannot achieve military or strategic victory. It cannot basically occupy the Arab cities. It cannot basically achieve victory by military means alone. Right? So you have a predicament there. Another assumption was that Israel is confronted with wars of no choice. They call it embrera. There's no choice. We have to fight. There's no other way. And another important tenet is that Israel is always standing alone. It must retain its qualitative and military edge. So there's no one. So Israelis must help themselves. Okay. Now Israel called the guy on the picture. He's, by the way, the designer of the Merkava tank. So he's a very famous Israeli general. He said that over the years, it has become clear that Israel's military thought to this day is little more than a series of footnotes to the doctrine which crystallized in the 50s. Although in the course of time, changes and refinements were made, not always for the better, these foundations were preserved. So I will explain what these foundations, the geostrategic predicaments are, and what implications were on the defense strategy and operational concepts. One, lack of strategic depth. Israel has always saw itself as a very small country, geographically. I think in 1948, the distance, the shortest distance between the sea and the border with Jordan was only like 9 miles. But basically, what that means is that Israel has very short warning time. If the war may occur. Israel cannot trade space for time. It cannot absorb enemy attack. Like, for example, China, right? Or other big country that basically, if there's invading force, you can absorb it. Israel cannot absorb invading attack, right? It cannot trade space for time. And that means also Israel cannot lose a single war. So in this picture shows that all the Israeli airfields are basically within minutes of flying time from these regions. So it's very, so geostrategically, if you're an Israeli general, so how do you defend this country? How do you, you see that you cannot really absorb any attack, right? The second key point is population inferiority. Israel, so it's always said at the beginning, as a very small country with a small population compared to its neighbors. So a lot of Israelis always put these ratios. Israel with direct neighbors 1 to 15, Israel versus Arab world 1 to 40, Israel versus Muslim world 1 to 200. So for one Israeli, there's always 15 people in the neighborhood. What that means is you have limitations on the size of armed forces. That means if you don't have the people, you can have a big army, right? You know, it's very similar to Singapore in a sense, right? You are vulnerable to attrition strategies. You cannot fight wars for a long time, right? You have, you know, you're sensitive to casualties. You know, if you lose people in war, you know, you are, it drains the population. It's very difficult, right? And it creates a defense burden on the economy and society. So again, one predicament, and you already see implications on defense strategy, right? The second one, you have lack of natural resources. Same thing as Singapore. Nearly complete external dependence on critical energy sources, shortages of supplies of water. What that means is, again, Israel cannot fight long wars, right? It cannot, you know, it doesn't have the resources to do that. At the same time, it cannot, you know, focus its military on all fronts at the same time. It has to choose one area and prioritize that area and basically go there and focus on concentration on one particular front. Right? And the third or fourth indicator in this category is superpower involvement. Now, Israelis always recognize the direct or indirect superpower involvement in the area. You know, for example, you know, a direct, maybe, you know, during the Cold War in 1970, you had Soviet pilots, you know, working with the Egyptians, you know, attacking, you know, during the war attrition, attacking the Israeli forces. Or indirect superpower involvement is the U.S., the role of the U.S. You know, the fact that U.S. basically assists the Israelis, you know, yearly, you know, with, you know, a certain amount of money, you know, over $2 billion. That creates also involvement, because that also constrains Israeli policy in a way, because they cannot really do what they want without, you know, thinking what the U.S. will think. So what that means strategically, you know, Israel must reach, you know, battlefield decision quickly. You know, wars must, you know, they have whatever they start doing militarily, they cannot do it forever, because once the superpower says stop, they cannot do that anymore. So at least for the first, you know, 30, 40 years. So the whole point is that Israeli leaders at the beginning realized that wars must be short, and they must be won decisively. Okay? So these are basically the basic tenets of the geostrategic predicament. So now they came up with, you know, how do we devise strategy? Now we have these conditions, and these conditions will drive our strategy. So there are three pillars of traditional Israeli concept: deterrence, early warning, and rapid military decision. Now you always hear whenever you know, when you go on TV and there's a you know, military action or something, the IDF does something, and the commentator or the Israeli general will say, we did it because we wanted to restore deterrence. Or deterrence, you hear that term all the time. You know, but what does deterrence really mean? What is deterrence? You know, and I think the best definition comes from Dr. Strangelove. I don't know if you saw that movie from the 60s. Deterrence is the art of producing the fear in the mind of the enemy. Okay? Now, in other words, in more academically words, the cost and benefits of a particular action will outweigh its benefits. And there are different types of deterrence and in Israeli strategic thinking. And I listed some of them, you know, from current deterrence, preventing escalation of low-intensity conflict; specific deterrence, preventing crises that threaten Israel's vital and peripheral interests; strategic deterrence, preventing general large-scale wars; and cumulative deterrence, basically convincing Israel's enemies that the Arab-Israeli conflict cannot be solved in the long term by military means at acceptable costs. You also see deterrence by, you know, military deterrence by denial and by punishment. So, you know, you want to deter by denial means basically preemptive or preventive action to deny enemy success on the battlefield. So
There was, I will talk about the 1967-68 war. That was precisely, deterrence by denial. And of course, we have deterrence by punishment, which came, into light in recent years. Destruction of enemy's forces, arsenal, and infrastructure, and penetration of enemy lines in the context of specific deterrence. Here, deterrence is very important part of Israeli strategic thinking. Because if you don't deter your enemy, he or she will, the enemy will attack you again, right? So deterrence is always convincing your enemy or your adversary not to attack, not to do a certain action that may regret. Now, Israel always had a policy of red lines during the Cold War. Basically, they said if you do a certain action, we will not stand. We will not stand alone. We will attack. We will counterattack. We will basically, extract heavy price from you if you do this. Right? So Israel's signal is deterrence. A lot of another part of deterrence is the Israeli policy of Amimut, the nuclear opacity. Israel has never publicly acknowledged or denied the existence of nuclear weapons. Right? So the fact is that nobody really knows if they are, but everybody, most of them assume that they have. Right? Even if that assumption, you're deterred to create anything, any action that may question the assumption. So the deterrence is a very important part. Actually, all the three parts are important. Second element is early warning. Early warning and early and tactical warning, strategic and tactical warning. If you target any Israeli to make a success on any military operations, you need three things: intelligence, intelligence, intelligence. Right? So, early warning. For Israelis, the IDF, its intelligence branch, the Amman, is on the same standing like the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. It's the only country in the world where the status of intelligence branch can be compared on the same level. Now, early warning, and for Israelis, it's not warning about intentions. It's not about, I want to find out what my enemy's intentions are. It's about showing that the effect that the deterrence is already failing. Basically, as somebody, I think it was also Reed Barjova said, it's a formation of a threat as an objective reality, right? So basically, the early warning shows or displays that the deterrence is already failing and we are going to war. And for most, especially for intelligent people in Israel, they see intelligence as the first line of defense, right? And Israel has been, seen, as intelligence branches. I saw a little bit on the bottom level. You see, all the way from the Mossad to the Oman to tactical intelligence, especially units like Slayer and Mashal. There's a lot of books have been written on Israeli intelligence, and it's a quite fascinating topic. Now, the third part of the security triangle is military decision. Okay, so deterrence have failed. We have an early warning that basically shows us the deterrence failed. Now we have to make a decision to go to war, right? And we have to make it rapidly. So, but because we are small and we don't have a large army, we cannot defeat our enemies, all right? We cannot basically, we can only deny the capability in a certain military round. So, not to destroy them, but destroy the capability. So a military decision, they call it, it's contextualized in a decisive operational victory. I think if I say it right. And the aim is to create reverse asymmetry. That means you turn your own disadvantages into advantages. Okay? So you are facing quantitatively superior armies around you, right? And you cannot really, destroy them forever, right? But you want to create conditions where you are, as a smaller, you are smarter, and you are basically able to
to win over it decisively. Right? Now, a lot of Israeli generals, they always have that concept in mind of military rounds. So if you look at the history of Israel, every 10 years, there has been war. You know, it's probably, you know, I don't know any other country that has that, but so they see it as a concept of military round. You know, so the question is not really, you know, is the war over? The question is really, when is the next round? Right? But for every round, whatever the round was, they try to achieve decisive operational victory. And they were not always successful, but the aim was there. The IDF Dictionary of Concepts says, a state of decision is recognized such as when the enemy loses its ability to act effectively against us. You know? So those are the three elements of traditional Israeli security concept as a form of defense strategy. Now, at the same time, Israeli security makers or policy makers, they have to prioritize between different threats, right? So there are always different types of threats, different priorities. So they conceptualize something called basic security and current security. Now, basic security were always the existential threats, the threats that actually threaten Israel's existence, right? Usually major conventional wars. At the same time, you know, they came up with what they call current security, or, you know, bitachon shotef, basically daily operational security. Israel is facing a lot of incursions, a lot of, you know, small scale, you know, conflicts that could harm but not really threaten Israel's existence. Right? So that's one of the really also important aspects of the concept. For the first 30 years, I would argue that the focus was on that existential security. So the first war, like 1948, the War of Independence, was contextualized, could be contextualized as an existential threat, existential security. Now, from the last 30 years or so, a lot of it is on the current security. But you could also argue that they are both intertwined. And basically, if anybody wants my elementary Hebrew, security in Israel, in Hebrew, it says bitachon. So that, you know, if you want one word in Hebrew, then there you go. Now, another interesting part, you know, how they conceptualize security in terms of circles of defense. You will hear it a lot, you know, when you read about Israeli concepts. Basically, again, they have to prioritize. You know, because we are small, we cannot focus our resources on everything. If everything is important, then nothing is important, right? So they conceptualize threats geographically, and they came up with the circles of defense: perimeter, intra-frontier, remote commitments. Now, the perimeter, that's the middle circle. Basically, those were existential threats, or maybe threats from conventional wars from, you know, from its neighbors: Egypt, Syria, Jordan. Maybe Lebanon is also there. Mostly Syria and Egypt. So that is the middle circle. The small circle denoted threats that came from within Israel, or from within the area, and mostly, you know, the West Bank and Gaza and inland. And then you have the broader circle, the remote commitment circle, which is, you know, looking at Iraq, Iran back then, and basically beyond. Right? So circles of defense also very important part of the concept. Now, during the Cold War, again, the focus was more on the conventional, on that middle circle. Now Israel is looking more on that remote commitment circle in terms of its basic security. Now, you have the defense strategy. Now, what does it mean for the IDF, for the army? What does it mean for the operational level? So, they came up, you know, how do we fight wars based on our geostrategic inferiority, you know, the conditions, based on the three pillars of defense strategy, how do we actually make operational concepts? What does it mean for the military? So I mentioned that Israel has no strategic depth. So militarily means you cannot really defend the country. You have to take the war to the enemy, right? So, they come up with the idea of offensive maneuver warfare. Now, offense means transferring the war in Israeli thinking to the enemy territory. Right? So wherever you can see these patterns over time. Whenever Israeli does any action, you'll see that that they're always pushing out. That means also seizing operational control and taking initiative. If you take the initiative, you disrupt the enemy's plans, right? You concentrate forces at a chosen point, you shorten the duration of the conflict, and you minimize casualties and reduce war costs. Right? So wars should be short and should be decisive, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning. So, offense will take care of that, theoretically. The second element was preemption, striking first. Don't wait. Right? If you wait, the enemy will amass amount of so much forces that you cannot basically handle it. So you basically go there and strike first in the face of a major imminent threat. This will improve the probability of an operational decisive victory. So in other words, if you wait, then you'll lose the advantage. If you go there and strike first, you still keep the advantage. And then again, you keep the momentum. You deny the enemy's plans, you achieve strategic surprise, and you mitigate the risk of superpower intervention. And you reinforce the credibility of deterrence. So again, goes to the circle. Right? And the third element was the rapid maneuver. Basically, there are three words: speed, mobility, and surprise, and flexibility, maybe more than three words. Basically, you want to move quickly, and you don't going to go directly head on head. You're going to go around, because you're facing more quantitatively more stronger enemies, so you're going to be facing them directly, right? So you always try to find a way to go around. So rapid maneuver was that. And during the first 30 years, this was associated with something what they call the all-tank zone. Basically, maneuver was done by tanks. And there's a saying that tanks lead the way. And during 1967, I'll come to that, you will see Israeli tank commanders basically charging ahead, exposed in their turrets, and they go straight. So, offense, preemption, and rapid maneuver. There are three elements of Israeli operational concept in the first 30 years or so. And that, I would say, a lot of the, basically in my presentation, you will see these patterns, right? Deterrence, early warning, and rapid military decision, or offense, preemption, rapid maneuver. These patterns are also seen, in Israeli military thinking, today in a different manner. But I'll come to that later. Now, to give you the example, it's 1967, the Six-Day War, is a perfect example of the operational maneuver. So in May 23rd, you had Egyptian forces amassing about 100,000 men in Sinai. May 23rd, the President Nasser, he closes the Strait of Tiran, which is a red line for Israel. And what the Israelis do, they don't wait. They come up with a very genius plan first, to take out Egyptian airfields. So on June 5th, at 7:45 in the morning, you have only 200 planes. It was most of the Israeli Air Force at the time. Again, they would not fly directly to Sinai, but they would fly north to the Mediterranean, and they would strike Egyptian airfields from the north. And they basically would preemptively take them out when the planes are all on the ground. Okay, so they come up with, and again, intelligence is the key. The IDF knew exactly where to strike. They knew, they had so much information, they knew the names of the Egyptian pilots, and where they go, where each bases are, and they knew everything. And they practiced for that, and basically surprised the Egyptians in one very fast strike. Now, after they eliminated the Egyptian air power, which was in 1867, you have to think about Egypt was the strongest country in the Middle East. You know, they wiped out in 2 days the 85% of the entire Egyptian Air Force, which is 200 planes. So the way they did it, it was very interesting. You know, the turnaround for each sortie was like 8 minutes. So one Israeli pilot basically, you know, they did a mission, came back. You know, the technicians had like 8 to 10 minutes to refuel the plane, rearm the plane, and you go again. And that's why they were able to, you know, to do that. And after, you know, Egypt lost its air superiority, the army moved in and basically went to Sinai and charged in. Now the story is that one Egyptian general basically gave the order to retreat. So all the Egyptian army was retreating. And the IDF was basically chasing them. And the problem was that for the Egyptians, that one, they didn't have much water, and two, you know, they got stuck because there are only like 3 or 4 passes in Sinai where you can actually go through. So, you know, you had these long columns of Egyptian armies, and they were wiped out. But anyway, the point is that the 6-Day War is a perfect example of operational maneuver warfare, and the original concept that was there. Now this whole concept idea came to a shock in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Deterrence, early warning, and rapid military decision failed. Right? So after 1967, you know, the IDF, the Israelis, they had so much confidence that nobody will attack them unless they have the Air Force or unless they feel strong enough. So they basically believed that nobody will be stupid enough, right, if I say it bluntly, right, to challenge their position. Of course, I have to say that after 1967, Israel got Sinai, the Golan Heights, and so that eliminated the problem of strategic depth. But anyway, the whole point is that, you know, Israelis were so overconfident that nobody will attack them, right? Now, of course, President Sadat in Egypt, they came up with a very interesting, deceptive plan to, you know, to join with Syria and attack, you know, Israel on both fronts at the same time on the Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Israeli calendar. And in fact, the Israeli leadership at the time, they did have all the signs that war is imminent. But precisely because of superpower involvement and because they didn't want to be seen as aggressors, they didn't decide to strike first. So you have IDF general, his name is David Elazar. He basically, called, Prime Minister Golda and said, you have to strike first. You have to take our planes and basically, strike first. But Golda says, no. We cannot do this because if you do this, in the eye of the world, we'll be seen as aggressors. Okay? So the whole, just to skip all this, this was, a big shock for Israeli. Egyptians were successful in penetrating the left line on the Sinai Peninsula, and basically, move in with a very different army than in 1967. Right? The way they solved the problem, they came up with, surface-to-air missiles that basically gave them a protection against Israeli fighter jets, and they came up with a with a remote-controlled anti-tank missiles. So when the Israelis came, because they knew the all-tank doctrine that whenever there's something, first of all, the Israeli Air Force will go in. So once the AIF basically launched a counterattack, they were all knocked down by a very dense surface-to-air missile network. At the same time, the Israeli tanks thought that they will go in and then all the Egyptian army will run away. It didn't happen. They had Soviet anti-tank missiles, and basically they were able to shoot a lot of tanks down. So anyway, the whole point is that the whole concept, that security was, that the Israeli bases on security came to a shock with 1973 war. They, Israelis back in the war came to almost 2,800 casualties, more than 10,000 units wounded. And basically the entire inventory of concepts went down the toilet. So you'll see, you'll talk about, whenever you talk with any Israeli general, you always say, 1973 is a turning point. It's a turning point how Israeli military and society viewed war and security in general. And you have strategic and operational implications. Right? For operations, you know, the implications was that the modern battlefield is more lethal than ever before. And then we have to basically change our concept to the new conditions. Okay? And most importantly, the war sparked a lot of political and strategic debate. Who's to blame? You know, what went wrong? For the first 30 years, you know, we had that concept, it worked well. You know, what went wrong? So from that moment on, you'll see a lot of debates going on, and a lot of blaming and a lot of soul searching. Eventually, the 73 young people were led to Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which basically eliminated the possibility or probability of war with Egypt for the next 30 years. At the same time, 1979, where the peace treaty was signed, you have Islamic revolution in Iran. Actually, 1979 is a very important year. It's a year of revolutions. So Iran went from being an ally of Israel to become its enemy. At the same time, you know, during these late 70s, Syria is increasingly involved in Lebanon. And I would argue that, you know, that this is a turning point where the era of conventional, high-intensity conventional wars comes to an end. And a new era of low-intensity conflict begins. And this is also a time where the complexity of Israel's strategic problems arise, because the compositions of the threat change. So 1979 is also a paradigm shift, in a way. But it's interesting, but Israelis, the idea didn't change its concepts. Okay, what they did, there was a lot of military buildup. So after the 73 war, you know, the IDF is more than doubled its size. So they received a lot of help from the US, and basically, but the concepts part didn't really change. You know, no matter what. But no matter what was what the lessons were learned, but they really didn't change the concepts. At the beginning of the 80s, you have, in 1981, you have an Israeli airstrike on Iraq, on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, in Iraq, Operation Opera. Again, you see preemption. You know, they don't wait until Iraq builds its nuclear capability. They go there and they basically strike it first. Right? So that concept was still alive. But of course, the problem came with 1982 war in Lebanon, the first Lebanon war. That was you know, put it very shortly, but it was a big mess for the IDF, because they amassed so much forces, and so much, you know, it was like more than, you know, twice the army that it was fighting in 73, and basically they thought that they were able to use the conventional concepts for a non-conventional enemy. In 1982, you see the beginning of a hybrid threat where you don't really fight a state. You fight a non-state actor within, you know, a very fragmented state. So basically they charged in, it was a very conventional you know, operation. They basically went into 3 columns. They went north of Lebanon. Originally they thought they were going to go only for 40 miles. No, they went, for the first time, they went all the way to an Arab capital. It had never happened before. And they stopped. They didn't go in, they stopped before Beirut. But the whole war proved to be very difficult, again, because, you know, a lot of the Israeli society would ask questions, why are we there? You know, why is it that we want to achieve? What is our mission there? And these questions are reflected in the Israeli society even today. I don't know if you saw the movie called Walls with Bashir 2 years ago. It's an animated documentary. It's wonderful. Or just last year there was a movie called Lebanon, which basically tells the story of Israeli tank crew going into Lebanon and facing, you know, dilemmas, you know, fighting in war. But anyway, it was not a heroic war as in 1967 or 1973. Something has changed. And that war has affected a lot of a lot of people in Israel. In fact, the brother of my friend, my best friend in Israel, also fought there, and and a lot of them have these post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, a lot of psychological issues, a lot of problems because a lot of things went wrong there. You have Sabra and Shatila, which indirectly is a very dark side of this war, and it should be mentioned. Basically, the massacre at the refugee camp. But the problem here for the IDF conceptually is you have a Syrian involvement as a state, involved into Lebanon, and a lot of different factions in Lebanon. So how do you basically conceptualize your strategy, who to fight? So that was the beginning also where, conceptually, some people were asking questions. So that came to a debate between IDF traditionalists and IDF reformers. Now, of course, I have to mention that Syria became the #1 country on Israel's list, in the early 80s after the war in Lebanon, because they were expecting another war with Syria. But what Syrians did in 82, 85, they came up with a policy of strategic parity. They said we cannot rely on forming an Arab coalition to fight against Israel. We have to build up our own military, that we are able at least to defend against Israel at the same time, perhaps mount military operations that we could be able on our own to take the Golan Heights back. So they basically made a tremendous military buildup for the 82, 85. It nearly crippled the Syrian economy, right? But the military, I think, also went from somewhere from 300,000 82 or 83 to almost more than 500,000, and they got a lot of help from the Soviet Union. At the same time, when they build up, they build up these complex defenses along the border, and basically a lot of Israeli strategists back then, they were asking, they say, if there's another war and we have to take the war to enemy territory, we cannot maneuver as we were able to do that before, because of the dense network of defenses. So in other words, they question the concept of offensive maneuver warfare, right? So there was a big debate between the ideas between traditionalists and reformers. Traditionalists like Israel Tal, the one guy on the picture that I showed at the beginning, he was saying, no, the tanks always lead the way. We have to keep our offensive principle intact because, it's a concept that stood the test of time. It is there to strengthen the deterrence, and we need to transfer the war into enemy territory. We cannot build our defense strategy on defense. But at the same time, you have reformers who are saying, no, we have to come up with new concepts, that would take into account, defensive strategy. They call it the problem with the Syrian strategic parity and basically the Syrian military buildup. They call it a saturated battlefield. They say the battlefield is so saturated, that basically we cannot move around. We have to do something else. And the way they come up, they look at, they started to think about a different operational and tactical innovation, and they started to look on technology. Right? So in other words, they were able to, they were basically thinking how to use technology to offset the fact they cannot do the offensive. So in 1982, you have, when the Lebanon war started, you have the air war in the Bekaa Valley. I don't know if you've heard about that. It's a very, it's a classic of the time. A lot of references go to that because Israelis pioneered a lot of the military concepts that advanced armies are working on today. And the Bekaa Valley was Syrians basically placed 19 or 20 surface of air missiles in the Bekaa Valley. And basically they were threatening the Israeli Air Force, right? And what Israelis did at the time in 1982, think about it, 82, they used UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. They call it RPVs, remotely piloted vehicles. So in 82, they were the first country actually use UAVs in combat. And basically what happened, these UAVs, they flew toward the SAMs, and basically the SAMs, the Syrians thought that those are Israeli jets, and they turn on the radar. Once the radars were on, the UAVs were able to pick up the frequencies, okay, and they basically mapped them where they are. And they relied the frequency to aerial commanders and basically guided the Israeli Air Force to move them. But anyway, so the point is that they started to look at technological and operational innovations to the strategic problems. But the debate was quite relevant for the 80s. Now we move to the 90s. And at the end of the Cold War, the whole situation again, the strategic situation again changed for Israel. Right? Soviet Union no longer would sponsor its Arab allies with arms. Soviet Union and basically the end of the Cold War means end of Soviet political and material support for Arab states. At the same time, you have the first Gulf War, the U.S. going to Iraq and using technologies again for revolutionary military affairs. A lot of these precision strikes, a lot of the basically everything that you saw on CNN back then, basically the revolutionized warfare. And at the same, that doesn't mean that Israeli security became basically, there was a peace sign. No. The threats, the composition of the threats have changed. And the security spectrum, the conflict spectrum for Israel became much more complex. It was no longer, not only the conventional threat, but it was a mix of low-intensity conflicts and terrorism on one hand, and at the same time asymmetrical threats and WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, on the other. So for the first, the low-intensity conflicts and terrorism, they call, Israelis call it the subconventional conflict. They are below the conventional level. And at the same time, you have a supra-conventional conflict, basically the ballistic missiles proliferation and weapons of mass destruction. So if for now, the key problem for Israeli defense thinkers is the convergence of these two. So, you know, you have a country like Iran getting nuclear capability and providing a nuclear umbrella to his, you know, proxy Hezbollah. You know, so the convergence of the threats. So you see a lot of thinking, a lot of Israeli thinking at the time started to change. And the idea was looking for new concepts again and new strategies how to deal with this. So in the 90s, you know, they focused, despite the peace process, and there was a lot of momentum going on, the low-intensity conflict, the intensifying Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues, and you know, and the IDF is facing a lot of low-intensity conflict. Basically, this is not like a high-intensity conventional war, but you know, it's very difficult, you know, to really, there are no clear-cut typologies between high or low. You know, if you are in there, if you are in the level of the conflict, I mean, if somebody, if you get shot, you know, it doesn't really matter whether it's high intensity or low intensity, you know. But conceptually, you know, you can do that distinction. And basically, they started to come up with solutions, you know, that would basically tackle the problem. And they use a lot of combined, integrated forms of warfare, where basically they were able to link intelligence, air power, and ground units together. And they started thinking about experimenting with these concepts. So if you have a commander on the ground or an intelligence source or asset on the ground who's able to relay the information to whether, you know, the helicopter or, you know, a military unit, but instant convergence between aerial and ground forces. So a lot of operation that you see is basically that convergence. And at the same time, you know, there's a new era of strategic thought in the idea. And that's a very interesting story. In 1995, the IDF's General Staff, they formed the School of Operational Command, and they established something called Operational Theory Research Institute, the OTRI. And from that moment on, that institute was a vital place for generating new ideas on how to fight nonlinear wars. And there were two generals who basically led that. And they were starting to think, you know, how do we devise concepts and understand warfare in a nonlinear operational environment? in which the enemy, technology, and environment form complex adaptive system. So they were looking at, totally rethinking, the whole idea of concepts, okay? And they started to educate the idea of core, and I will come back to that. Again, here's my low intensity pump in 2001. The IDF came up with the low intensity limited conflict doctrine. And again, it has a new language and it uses a new vocabulary, and basically you see, that the concept of victory has changed within the idea. It was no longer about destroying the enemy, it's not about the physical destruction, but it was about containment and fatiguing the enemy. And shifting towards preemptive strategies, and there were a lot of new concepts like intelligence-driven operations. Again, what I mentioned before, that whatever the assets, intelligence assets are, they would use that information and basically rely that to select a shooter or select a unit. But you can, at the time, you have a second intifada going on, which was a very bloody affair for both sides. And you can categorize IDF counter-terror strategies into three categories: offensive, defensive, and punitive. So for offensive, you see the idea of going against terrorist leaders and infrastructure to preemptively disrupt attacks at the planning stage. For example, the 2002 defensive shield was a 3-week operation in West Bank. It could be categorized as offensive. They basically went in, they wanted to preemptively locate the sources of the launching pads, they call it the launching pads of terror. Then you see a lot of defensive strategies, creating obstacles for terrorists who are actually on their way to do they act or disrupt attacks at the final stage, active or passive means. But the controversial wall that runs around Jerusalem and West Bank, the 8-meter wall, should be categorized as a defensive strategy in terms of counter-terror strategy. You want to prevent somebody, a suicide bomber, go over. And then they had the controversial punitive strategy, targeted assassination. Basically, they would identify terrorist leaders, and they would basically go in there and take them out, as surgically as possible. But anyway, the whole point is that the idea of this has shifted from focusing on conventional wars to low-intensity conflict and counter-terror strategies, particularly in the beginning of 2000s. And here I will give you an example. They faced, the whole idea of operational maneuver warfare doesn't really work in an urban area, urban settings. You have very dense populated cities, so the idea has to come up with concepts how to maneuver, how to conduct, how to communicate, how to make logistics. So the whole, the whole entire concepts had to change. And at the same time, it's not like during conventional wars where you had clear enemy, where you know who your enemy is, and basically you have a beginning and end of a war, and you can clearly identify the lines. Here you have basically elements of both civilian population and at the same time, the military wings, all crowded together in one densely populated space. So if I'm an IDF commander, how do I, I have to rethink the way I operate. I have to rethink my my entire strategy. Right? So in 2002, for example, they came up with very innovative concepts. Okay, this is a picture of a refugee camp, and Nabi was in the background, and the black roads, those are streets. Okay, so the Palestinian terrorists, basically, or the militant wings, they're expecting the IDF to go like in the conventional army by street. You're using the street, you will use a car, you go by in, and you will go into town, and you will open the door, and you will open the window, and that's how you go, to a house. So what they did, they booby-trapped everything. They placed mines on the streets. They basically booby-trapped everything what they could, because they were expecting, the IDF to go in as a regular army. But the IDF, again coming back to the Autry Institute, they came up with this concept of, you know, moving through walls. They reinterpret the environment. You know, they basically came, you know, to see the environment as a flexible medium of warfare. And they started to come up with concepts like inverse geometry. So what do I do if I cannot move in conventional means? I'll think about alternatively, right? So they walk through walls. The way basically was very simple. They built holes in a house, and they moved from house to house, you know, using you know, just a hammer and basically technology. So instead of using a door, they would basically make a hole in a wall and then move horizontally through a wall and vertically through a floor. So they came up with it basically, you know, and they did it in three approaches, you know, at the same time. So they caught everybody by surprise, you know. So they wanted to basically reinterpret the logic of an enemy and basically the way the enemy thinks, right? So this is just an example of, you know, of the conceptual development at the time. And the whole idea behind it was something called systemic operational design. And this theory, I mean, it is very popular now in the US Army. A lot of Americans basically learning about SOD. And SOD basically sees the rival as a system. Okay? It's not only, you know, you as the enemy, but they try to rethink the way they think about the rival enemy. Rival as a system: cultural, economic, political, social, strategic, command. There are different systems. And the idea is to not destroy the system, but to affect its ability to function. Right? So, how do we fight terrorists, for example? It's not, you know. So you have to think about the enemy in a different way. It's not a conventional enemy. So they came up with a really, you know, different ways of thinking, you know, to fight a war, you know, in low intensity conflicts. And this became very, you know, debated topic within the idea. There were people who basically accepted it and who tried it out. Like, for example, like the moving through the walls, this is the SOD. Right? General Kohavi, who was a student of O3, you know, basically implemented this. But there was a lot of debates, you know, from the traditionalists who say, no, this is so complex and so difficult that we don't even know what it means. Now, Dan Halutz in 2006, he signed a new doctrine based on the SOD, right? So what happens was the entire lexicon of operational concept of the idea that changed. So traditionally, you have a very classic terms of objective, mission, method, initiative, persistence, unit of action, victory. Basically, you can give a clear command to a soldier, and he knows what the objective is, what the method is, and basically that was the traditional lexicon. But a new one, were completely different terms, completely different frameworks. So if I'm commander on the field and I get an order that I have to create a shock paralysis, what does that mean? Or I have to think about what is my campaign rationale? Conscious burning of the enemy, diffuse warfare. So O3 basically, you know, the whole argument is that O3 subverted the entire idea of thinking at the time, and then Halutz signed something he didn't understand. Now what happens at the same year? You have a second Lebanon War. And despite tactical superiority, you know, despite broad international support, the idea was unable to deny Hezbollah's military capability. David, again, there's a big debate whether SOD was really implemented or not. On one side, you have people saying, no, the idea was not really implemented because the soldiers didn't have time to study it. And at the same time, you have people say, no, this whole thing was a whole disaster. We tried this and just didn't work. And there's a Vinograd Commission, which is official inquiry. What, you know, the Israelis have a very interesting tradition. Whenever something goes wrong, they don't hide it, they debate it. So for every failure, you know, there's a commission and there's a commission of inquiry. So in this case, the Vinograd Commission, you know, they came up with they pointed out, you know, what went wrong. Now again, one of the important complaint was ambiguity in operational orders. So how do you leverage effects? You imagine you are somebody on the ground and you get the order, leverage effects. What does that mean? Right? So a lot of these guys on the ground were confused. They didn't know what that really means, right? At the same time, you have a lot of other problems. You know, a lot of the senior commanders were not present on the battlefield. So there was a big debate in Israel. A lot of people were saying, you know, it's a plasma screen war. It's not commanders like in traditional wars before. They were always the first ones in a battle. Here you have people basically far away, and you know. So there's a lot of debate. Now we come to 2011, 2010, and again there's a big change in terms of operational concept. And what I understand is, you know, I mean, this is fairly new. The IDF now doesn't distinguish between low intensity, high intensity conflicts. They don't care if it's a conventional, non-conventional, low intensity. They don't think about it anymore. That's the whole main argument. Whereas the others, the traditionalists, say, you know, it was implemented and it just didn't work, and they basically hijacked it. But you're right, you know, Nave and his colleagues are basically, they were opted out. The OT was shut down. And you know, a lot of it has to do with political infighting within the IDF. And you can see that within, you know, the new IDF chief, you know, and the relationship between the old IDF chief, Ashkenazi with Barak, you know, that the animosities and basically miscommunication between those two, you know, the impact it has, you know. But I would argue that there's a number of people who still are interested in SOD, and the point is that because it's the Americans who are interested in SOD, right? A lot of, you know, the U.S. Army War Colleges and any, in fact, NAVA and this, you know, and the SOD gang, they go and give seminars in the States, and they basically try to modify the framework to U.S. needs. So there's a lot of interest in that concept from the American side, which gives, of course, those proponents the credibility to continue. But within the IDF itself, it's really hard to say. You know, I mean, I would say the whole lexicon that I showed, the CONOP, this has been disbanded, right? So, you know, in 2006, when they came up with the new concepts of operations, you know, they went back to basics. You know, they basically discarded it. But now this is a new step, right? So think about it as not an evolutionary step to get away from the traditional concepts of the operational level, right? I mean, they thinking it continues. You know, they have a whole research gang there and thinking about, you know, of different concepts at the same time. You know, and a lot of it came from the Operation Castlet in Gaza in 2008, where they tried new ideas. And you know, Israel is interesting because the operational experience shapes the concepts, rather than concepts shape the operational experience, which is very unique, right? In other countries, you know, you come up with a concept first, and that translates into operational experience. In Israel, they always have the technology and operational experience, and they didn't have a concept. And they, you know, came back later and they tried to, you know, operationalize it. But now with this, you know, I would say, you know, the intellectual momentum is there. I mean, elements of that. To what degree, you know, which way it will go, and I'm sure it will be changed. You know, but this is just to show you that they don't stop thinking about it. They come up with new ideas.
I'll come back to you, Roy, afterwards.
My name is Amr. I'm an MBA student in police school. Yeah, the question is, how ready is the Israeli forces to combat, or at least to what a guerrilla war against Hezbollah, for example? Especially Hezbollah is using two forces, actually, like they're acting as guerrilla fighters. At the same time, they're using a lot of very advanced techniques and advanced weapons from Iran. So do you think that Israel is ready to combat something like that?
I think since 2006, I think both forces have evolved and improved. So Hezbollah's capability, I think they have more missiles than they had before, and they have more, they learned also, it was also experience for them, what happened in 2006. So they always try to use attack Israeli weakness, whether it's the casualties, whether it is, whatever, they always try to identify. At the same time, you could argue that the idea is learn as well. And they come up with new ideas and new ways. Most importantly, I think for the Israelis is the threat of the Katyusha rockets, right? And the different types of rockets, and also from Gaza. So they are trying to really operationalize the missile defense system at the lower tier, right? They could take care of these missiles, right? But I'm sure that Israel the idea has learned from it, and so did Hezbollah, and I think, in the next round, it's wait to see. But again, problem for the IDF is they have these strict rules of engagement now, because they know they are, they're operating on the world's, camera, they're on TV, right? So, if you have a terrorist, comes in with this, equipment and he places it next to a school, a hospital, or whatever, and then as much as Israel tries to mitigate collateral damage, these things happen and somebody, civilians get hit. That's a problem for the IDF. So they feel much constrained in terms of what they, the way they operate. And but I'm sure they have learned lessons. And the Vinograd Commission, politically it was on a political level, but internally, I think with Ashkenazi, he came back. He didn't. He interviewed for the first 2-3 years because he wanted to put the idea back in shape. But again, how do you fight, non-linear enemy? I mean, how do you distinguish? That is the problem, right? But I think from my interviews, it's the answer always I get is Israel has to be prepared for both. For whether it's the the conventional wars like you mentioned, at the same time the low intensity conflicts, right? So they have to but again how do you train your people for that? How do you conceptualize strategies is a problem. But the whole maybe the broader level, the question is going back to the original concept. That is very debated whether that stands. On one side you have people that say that the basic strategic assumptions have not really changed. The strategic triangle, the deterrence, early warning, and rapid military decision are basically the same. We need deterrence, we need early warning, and we need to make rapid military decision, right? But there are, of course, people who say that deterrence no longer works. How do you deter a terrorist? How do you apply that to a non-state actor, right? So so there are elements which are relevant, and there are at the same time elements which may be obsolete, right? So but again, I'm looking at the strategic, operational, and military dimension of the conceptual side, because they do a lot more, I think, on the practical side, in terms of technology and the people. Right? So I have one Air Force chief told me we want to combine the best people with the best technology. We don't want to focus on only just getting best technology, but no, we want to have the best people and the best technology together. And that way, you can be effective to what sense.
If I just can ask you a question, what struck me throughout this whole debate that you described was the absolute absence in terms of any discussion with regard to low intensity of driving a wedge between whatever the military forces that you're encountering, be it Hamas and the local population. Or even if you assume that you cannot drive that wedge, but in any case, any effort not to infuriate, let's say, local public opinion any further than you would have to. That seems to be absolutely absent.
Exactly, yeah.
And as, in a sense, in a much larger debate, it seems, as I listen to you, and I've followed a bit of this, and I've seen the Israelis physically in action and whatever, in various of their wars, it struck me as
we
It
can
was a
argue.
debate, variations on a theme.
Mm.
There seemed to be no creativity in that debate. There seemed to be, in a tactical sense, thinking outside the box, but there seemed to be no real thinking outside the box. I mean, that's what I thought, you know, as I listened to this whole
Yeah.
thing, probably what I walked away with most.
I think you are right in terms of how do you apply soft power instead of hard power. A lot of it is hard power, right? But you're absolutely right. Whether I don't think the IDF has any, or the Israeli has any, soft power strategy. In other words, how do I, make others want what I want?
Have
right?
you asked them why not?
I haven't really thought about that, but if you talk with the, I don't know if it would be even possible. They would basically discard it in the first place as an assumption that it wouldn't work. Because the conflict is so ingrained and so, entrenched that, whoever works with Israel is seen as a collaborator on the other side, right? So those Palestinians or whoever works for Israel, are basically rejected, So I think there is a big gap, in that hard and soft power dimensions. But, I think, there are a lot of, political lines, within, Israel, that you have left and right, religious, non-religious, and they are debating different approaches. But you can definitely distinguish the left side of the Israeli society, and it came already from the 80s, 90s, where you have a movement, the peace movement within Israel, and you have people within Israel basically arguing that, we should think differently. Right? And at the same time, you have the hardliners and who, there's always been polarized. When I was at the Hebrew University, there was always demonstrations by the peace movement, and they call themselves Peace Now, Shalom עכשיו, right? And those are young kids and young people, who think, differently. And there's a lot of, Arab-Israeli dialogue on the young level. Right? That you try to have peace studies, coexistence, and there are some areas where they try to, work in different projects, right? But I don't think that this has, except, maybe for the period of Rabin, when Rabin was the prime minister, I think when he was assassinated, that was the end of it, So it depends I don't know, maybe, who will be, the next prime minister or the political leadership will be. The problem is with the current government is that they are so, how should I put it? They are so tied to the coalition. I mean, to the parties that they how should I put it? I mean, it would be the end of the government if somebody would say, if Netanyahu would say, we will make a concession. So any type of concession for the Israeli government, it definitely means political suicide, because the coalition is so much ingrained by the different parties. So I think we have to wait, down the line, maybe the new generation, and maybe even for the Arab generation. I mean, think about the Arab Egyptian protests. I mean, it's all young people, and I think they would think differently about the conflict as well. So, but at the same time, you have people who say we have to remain realistic. The fact is that we didn't have any suicide bombers for the last, several months doesn't mean that it's, that it will never happen again. So, you have those arguments there. Right? But it is, again, I'm not an insider, I'm always out. But it's a very good question.
Anybody else?
I'd like to go back to your presentation. Last question for me. You discussed about the policy of Amimut, and we're now living in times when people are lesser forgiving of opacity of any country, and this entire policy of nuclear opacity and that Israel adopts, while stressing an eagle-eye surveillance on Iran's own nuclear developments, where does it make Israel stand in terms of global, of its own global image?
Officially, nobody would say that there is a need to
change any policy for, so whatever you read, there's always, Israeli statements, are very, very short and clear on that, and they would not change the term, the policy of nuclear ammunition. The problem is, what happens if Israel really becomes nuclear, and it really develops nuclear weapons? Doesn't mean, do I change my nuclear strategy as well? Right? And I'm sure they have people thinking about it as we speak, right? Because, what the implications, will be, will be game changing. But at the same time, it's debatable, the fact that nuclear opacity has worked well for Israel is the fact that they never really admitted that they had nuclear weapons, or they deny or confirm that they have in a specific way. It worked for them because they're able to to navigate through all the international law. They don't have to basically abide by that. If you confirm you have a nuclear arsenal, it's, from an international perspective, it changes a lot of things. So the nuclear opacity has worked well for Israel. And I think, if you think about the 1973 war, for example, the Syrians stopped at the edge of the Golan Heights. They didn't go. The same thing for Egyptians, the fact that, you're not sure, if they really have nuclear weapons or not, but you assume that they do, it changes your strategy and perception as well, right? So, it's a very sensitive, of course, in Israel you always have to say that the caveat, according to official foreign sources, according to foreign sources, Israel has a, policy of nuclear ambiguity, so. The fact I'm not Israeli, I can say.
Anybody else?
But it's a very interesting. I would suggest you continue to study and read about what's going on in the Middle East. Again, Israel's experience has a lot of lessons that could be learned elsewhere, and it's a fascinating, complex study. And it's not easy to do research on that, but it's very fascinating, and I thank you very much for coming here and taking your time to do the schedule. And thank you very much.